Hello, today's daily reading comes from the Book of Wisdom, chapter 17, and reads as follows: For your judgments are great and hard to interpret, therefore undisciplined souls went astray. For when lawless men had supposed that they held a holy nation in their power, they, prisoners of darkness and bound in the fetters of a long night, kept close beneath their roofs, laid exiled from the eternal providence. For while they thought that they were unseen in their secret sins, they were divided from one another by a dark curtain of forgetfulness, stricken with terrible awe and very troubled by apparitions. For neither did the dark recesses that held them guard them from fears, but terrifying sounds rang around them, and dismal phantoms appeared with unsmiling faces. And no force of fire prevailed to give light, neither were the brightest flames of the stars strong enough to illuminate that gloomy night, but only the glimmering of a self kindled fire appeared to them, full of fear. In terror they considered the things which they saw to be worse than that sight, on which they could not gaze. The mockeries of their magic acts were powerless now, and the shameful rebuke of their boasted understanding. For those who promised to drive away terrors and disorders from a sick soul, these were sick with a ludicrous fearfulness. For even if no troubling thing frightened them, yet scared with the creeping of vermin and hissing of serpents, they perished trembling in fear, refusing even to look at the air, which would not be escaped on any side. For wickedness condemned by a witness within is a coward thing, and being pressed hard by conscience always has added forecast of the worst. For fear is nothing else but a surrender of the help which reason offers, and from within the expectation of being less makes of greater account the ignorance of the cause that brings the torment. But they all through the night which was powerless indeed, and which came upon them out of the recesses of powerless Hades, sleeping the same sleep, but were haunted by monstrous apparitions, and now were paralyzed by their souls, surrendering for sudden and unexpected fear came upon them. So then, whoever it might be, sinking down in this place, was kept captive, shut up in that prison which was not barred with iron, for whether he was a farmer or a shepherd or a laborer whose toils were in the wilderness, he was overtaken and endured that inevitable necessity, for they were all bound with one chain of darkness, whether there was a whistling wind or a melodious sound of birds among the spreading branches, or a measured fall of water running violently, or a harsh crashing of rocks hurled down, or the swift course of animals bounding along unseen, or the voice of wild beasts harshly roaring, or an echo rebounding from the hollows of the mountains, all these things paralyzed them in terror. For the whole world was illuminated with clear light and was occupied with unhindered works, while over them alone was spread a heavy night, an image of the darkness that should afterward receive them, but to themselves they were heavier than darkness. Chapter 18. But for your holy ones there was great light. Their enemies hearing their voice, but seeing not their form, counted it a happy thing that they too had suffered, yet for that they do not hurt them. Though wronged by them before, they are thankful, and because they had been at variance with them, they begged for pardon. Whereas you provided a burning pillar of fire to be a guide for your people's unknown journey, and a harmless sun for their glorious exile, for the Egyptians well deserved to be deprived of the light and imprisoned by darkness. They who had imprisoned your children, through whom the incorruptible light of the law was to be given to the race of men, after they had taken counsel to kill the babes of the holy ones, and when a single child had been abandoned and saved, to convict them of their sin, you took away from them their multitude of children and destroyed all their army together in a mighty flood. Our fathers were made aware of the night beforehand, that having sure knowledge they might be cheered by the oaths which they had trusted. Salvation of the righteous and destruction of the enemies was expected by your people. For as you took vengeance on the adversaries by the same means, calling us to yourself, you glorified us. For holy children of good men offered sacrifice in secret, and with one consent they took upon themselves the covenant of the divine law, that they would partake alike in the same good things and the same perils. The fathers already leading the sacred songs of praise, but the discordant cry of the enemies echoed back, and the pitiful voice of lamentation for children was spread abroad. Both servant and master were punished with the same just doom, and the commoner suffering the same as king. Yes, they all together, under the form of death, had corpses without number, for the living were not sufficient even to bury them, since at a single stroke their most cherished offspring was consumed. For while they were disbelieving all things by reason of the enchantments upon the destruction of the firstborn, they confessed the people to be God's son. For while peaceful silence wrapped all things, the night in her own swiftness was in the mid course. Your all powerful word leaped from heaven out of the royal thrones, a stern warrior into the midst of the doomed land, bearing as a sharp sword your authentic commandment, and standing it filled with all things with death. And while it touched the heaven, it stood upon the earth. Then immediately apparitions and dreams terribly troubled them, and unexpected fears came upon them, and each one thrown her here half dead, another there, made known why he was dying. For the dreams disturbing them forewarned them of this, that they might not perish without knowing why they were afflicted. But experience of death also touched the righteous, and a multitude were destroyed in the wilderness. However, the wrath didn't last long. For a blameless man hurried to be their champion, bringing the weapon of his own ministry, prayer, and the atoning sacrifice of incense. He withstood the indignation and set an end to the calamity, showing that he was your servant. And he overcame the anger not by strength of body, not by force of weapons, but he subdued him who was punishing by word, by bringing to remembrance oaths and covenants made with the fathers. For when the dead had already fallen in heaps once upon another, standing between, he stopped the wrath and cut off the way to the living. For the whole world was upon his long robe, and the glories of the fathers were upon the engraving of the 4 rows of precious stones, and your majesty was upon the diadem of his head. The destroyer yielded to these, and they feared, for it was enough only to test the wrath. Amen.